Propagating plants by divisions is another method for propagation, and it's done with plants that have a clumping form. As the clump of that plant gets larger and larger, often the center part dies out. The soil becomes impoverished in the center there, and you get a clump that's just too big for the space or doesn't look that good anymore and needs revitalization. And division is a great way to revitalize that plant and the soil, or just to make more of that same plant for spreading out into other areas. Divisions are done with plants that are clumped in form, like bamboo, or clumping grasses, like this Muhlenbergia, agapanthus. All these and many more have a clumping form that tend to get too big for a site and too big for their own britches too, and they start to die off in the center, like I said in the last slide. So there's a few reasons to do divisions, but it's an effective way for propagating more of the same species, for cloning really more of that same and making more individuals for your own use or for sale. One example from the natural world, not from landscaping, of a plant that has a clumping form that will slowly get bigger and bigger and die out in the center is the creosote bush, Lauria tridentata. These live in the Mojave Desert in Southern California and into the Chihuahuan Desert in northwestern Mexico and around Texas, Arizona, in the United States. So the creosote bush starts as one clump and it gets bigger and bigger, and then the center dies out. And it's found that these rings that, 50 years ago, people didn't really think about it. They just thought those were all separate bushes, but they're actually all part of the same original organism. So they're clones. And some of these creosote rings have been dated to be over 10,000 years old. So that's that same clump getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what you see left now are just the edges in this ring, and the center has died. So it's very different than what we'll do in landscaping and divisions, but it's an interesting example from nature about this growth form that lends itself to divisions. So again, if you leave a clumping plant in the same place for quite a while, it usually gets overgrown and too big, overcrowding. The center dies out, and part of the reason the center dies out is natural, but part of it is too that the soil gets depleted from the plant having recently grown there, and it can't support itself anymore. So it has a dead center and it forms this ring. And in landscaping, we consider that not so attractive. Usually we're putting this nice little clumping grass in our landscape because we want it to be full, not to have a dead center. So that's the time that you could consider dividing that plant up and starting over. It kind of reboots it. So taking a clump of a plant, and this looks like a peony here, you dig around the drip line, so on the outer edges of where the leaves cover the surface. If you look down from the top, you cut all the way around where you could see the soil, where the plant is not covering the soil. So the roots, most of the roots are right under the canopy or under the leaves of that plant. And so you dig around that, and then you slowly dig under it and lift it up. And look at the roots. You check out, see what the roots look like, and you can let the roots kind of help guide you about how to pull that clump of stems apart. Usually you're taking that clump that you've dug up and dividing it into a few, 3 to 5 or more separate little plants. You want to make sure each chunk that you pull that clump apart in kind of a natural way. The roots come apart pretty easily. There should be nice stems and roots on each clump. Obviously, you wouldn't want to take just a branch off that had no roots attached to it. That wouldn't do too well. Too small a clump won't do too well in the first year. It might take a while to grow back. So especially if you're doing this for a landscaping situation, like at a client's house, or you're doing this for propagation of the species, you want to get a sizable clump so that it matures quickly. It pretty quickly looks like a nice plant. It doesn't stay the spindly little thing that you've got to nurture back to health. So you want to take enough. Divide perennials when the plants are dormant, and that's usually when the least effort is being put into the above ground growth and the storage is in the roots, and they can handle being moved around and pulled apart more easily. And keep those roots cool and moist while you're bringing it up and pulling it apart and setting it out before you replant it. Make sure they stay moist, and shady would be good. And if you have cool weather or overcast weather, that's a great time to do divisions. You know the roots that you pull up won't dry out while you're waiting to pot them up. Of course, use the vigorous sections of the plant first, so the sections on the side that look the best. You don't want to use the middle section of plant, the part of the plant that looked kind of dead, didn't have any leaves, of course. And replant portions that are no more than 20 to 25% of the original. So you want to take it down to at least, if you got a clump, cut it into fourths or pull it into fourths or fifths, and not too much bigger, because what it does is plants are really cool in the sense that animals, you can't ever kind of reset their maturity, but plants you can. Pruning them really hard, a lot of plants can be pruned hard, meaning cutting way back into the woody tissue, or this divisions, cloning through stem cuttings. You take a plant that's already mature and you can kind of knock it back to a younger maturity level, and it starts over again and gets really vigorous growth again. That's really what plants are adapted to when you think about the seasons. Plants that go dormant in the winter and then they come back again in the spring, it's like every time they're exhibiting young, vigorous growth. Divisions are the same, as you are pulling off a smaller portion of that clump, replanting it, and it exhibits the conditions and the characteristics of being a very young new plant, which is what most people like. They like it to look young, vigorous growth, full, green, flowering. And that's a big reason why people do divisions, is again to reset the plant's maturity and to get it back into a more beautiful stage that the humans think it looks better. Doing the divisions, digging the plant up and pulling it apart, is best to do when the plant is dormant. And in addition, when a plant is dormant, it's not actively growing or flowering. Some plants you can do this. Some are so hardy, it doesn't matter how you handle them and what time of the year and maturity level. You could divide them up and they would be okay. So if you do divide a plant while it's flowering, remember that this plant will have a lower chance of doing well and surviving because it's putting a lot of energy into its flowers and doesn't have as much storage in the roots at that time. Often when you do divisions, the top part of the plant dies back after your division, even if it's green and looks pretty good. Often you divide it and you replant it and the top part dies back, and then new leaves will come out. If it's flowering, it has even less stored energy in the roots to come back from. So just be aware that it causes stress to the plant and it has less chances of survival, but it definitely can be done when some plants are flowering. They can do just fine with the division. Like I said earlier, let the roots be your guide. Look at the roots carefully after you pull the plant up. It's okay for the roots to be exposed to the air for a while. Just keep them moist, and you can look at them. Is there places where looks like you could kind of push your fingers in and easily pull the clump apart? Things like with an iris, it comes to mind. I've done a lot of that. You pull up these rhizomes and they're kind of intertwined. Sometimes you can pull them apart. Sometimes you have to break them. The more you break it, the more possibility for pathogens to get in and cause disease on that roots. If you do end up dividing something like that has a big thick rhizome, like ginger and gladiolas and irises too, you would want to leave those out in the open air in a shady spot, in a cool spot, and let them cure. It's like if you broke those big rhizomes of something like an iris, it has a big wound, and you want to let that kind of scab over or callus dry off before you put it back in the soil where there are soil pathogens. But overall, let the roots be your guide. Some clumps will not, They will not just easily pull apart with your fingers, so you'll actually have to use a knife to saw them. Sometimes we use a saw on some of our bigger grass clumps that we do divisions, and you actually have to cut them apart. Usually with those that have thick, massive fibrous root systems, those can handle being cut and they'll be okay. And again, use only the healthy sections of the plant. If you see diseased areas, pull those out and compost them. Some plant organs that I want to tell you about that are commonly used in divisions: stolons, offsets, bulbs, corms, crowns, and rhizomes. Stolons and runners are a little bit different, but the terms are often used interchangeably. A stolon is a horizontal, fleshy stem that can root, so it's horizontal on the surface of the soil, and then it produces new shoots where it touches the ground. Think of a strawberry. Those little arms that reach out from the mother plant are called stolons, and they're somewhat fleshy, and where they touch the ground a little further away from the mama, they root. And you can cut those off in between. So it's like a division when you actually cut those off and pot it up or plant it somewhere new or just let it spread. If you cut it off from the plant, it's a division. If you let it spread, it's just a strawberry spreading by stolons. A runner is a slender stem, not quite so fleshy, that originates from the leaf axil, so it's the place between the stem and the leaf, and grows along the ground or downward from a hanging basket, producing a new plant at its tip, like the spider plant. Plantlets that you see at the tips of the runners can be rooted while they're still attached to the mother plant, and that would be called a runner. But both of these are just two types of plant organs and growth forms that lend themselves to divisions. Offsets are pretty much what they sound like. So you have a mother plant, and set a little off from the central axis of the mother plant is a baby plant that's coming from her roots. So plants often that have a rosetted stem, a whole bunch of leaves that all join in one particular point is a rosette shape, like dandelion is rosette form. And they often form like these agaves. They form new little pups or offsets on the side that come from the roots of the mother plant. And you can just take a shovel, and like in this picture, you would take a shovel and cut between the mother plant and the offset, and it severs them. And as long as the offset has a little bit of its own root system, it will be fine on its own. Sometimes they don't even have to have a root system yet, and they still will. After you cut the offset off, it will form roots and be fine on its own. Date palms, the kind that we get the edible dates from. Haworthias, which are like a little succulent. Bromeliads, lots of cactus, these agaves, they all form offsets. And they're a very viable way of propagating more of these plants. A local nursery here to Santa Barbara is the San Marcos Growers, and they specialize in lots of different cultivars of agaves. And one of the ways they propagate them is they'll take the mother agave and they do this process called coring, where they take, if you look straight down at an agave, imagine a small agave like the size of a dinner plate, and they will just, they will cut the center of the mother plant out. You know, it's pretty brutal. They're just taking her central growth stem out. And what the mother plant does is it reacts, it's basically knows, oh, uh-oh, I'm dying, and it shoots out a whole bunch of offsets on the sides, and all of those can get cut off. So from coring one mother agave plant, you can get 20 to 30 little offsets, and so that makes it a very viable way of cloning that particular cultivar, because the genetics remain the same in the offsets, cloning that by divisions. Plants that grow by bulbs are also a great candidate for divisions. Often a bulb forms little bulblets off the side of the main bulb, and those can be cut off and used for propagating and planting. Just gently pulling up the bulbs apart and replanting them would be the way to go. And probably some of you have already done this. Tulips and narcissus are two very common bulb forming plants that form. They have that, you know, the one bulb to start with, but it's like, imagine a garlic clove. You know, it's got or a garlic head where it has a whole bunch of cloves. That's exactly like a bulb, or very similar. So you can pull off the side pieces and each of them can grow individually. In fact, garlic is propagated by division. So the garlic you eat or you buy in the store, they're all special cultivars that have been bred to have big cloves and strong flavor. And so they're all cloned. They're not grown from seed, and those are all done by divisions. A bulb, as discussed in the last slide, is a little different than a corm. They look the same. If you've been a gardener for a while, you would have kind of considered them the same, and they're technically different. So a bulb is a plant that has a short stem and fleshy leaves that are attached at the bottom. So that thing, like in an onion that looks like a bulb, it is a bulb, but it's made up of a bunch of leaves. The layers of the onion are all the tops of the leaves, and they join at the base, at the bottom of the onion, the part you cut off when you're chopping up an onion. And that's where the roots come off of. So the stem is that little section between the roots and those leaves that form the part that we eat. A corm is a little different. It's actually not made up of leaves. The leaves are coming from the outside and the top, but it's an underground swollen organ that stores food for the plant. It's not fleshy leaves that are storing the nutrients like in an onion. So just the difference between the two. A gladiola is something that's technically a corm. So I want to describe that before I talk about how corms are also used in division. Because corms grow as they do, similar to bulbs, the large new corm will form at the top of the old corm, and tiny, what they call cormels, form around the large corm. So it's very similar to how bulblets, little bulbs, kind of form on the side of a bulb, like a garlic head has a whole bunch of different those things we call cloves, are like bulblets. A corm is similar, but it forms small corms on the sides. Not super important that you know the difference between these two, but this is a class that talks about plants, so we want you to get it right. But functionally, they are divided and they grow and need to be treated the same between corms and bulbs. But you remove those little cormels and gently separate them and plant them in new places. And dusting all the new corms, bulblets too, with a fungicide can be helpful if you're going to store them for a while, because that cut open surface where you broke it off can be a place where the pathogens can take over. Yeah, and one thing you will notice along the way, and this is just kind of a funny side note, not to be tested on, but there's all kinds of little terms, and I've been a botanist for many years, so it seems that lots of botanists really love making up and using interesting different words. So hopefully they don't bog you down, but when I hear these terms like bulblet and bulb and cormel and corm, it reminds me of all my botanist friends who really enjoy creating their own language around all these plant parts. All right, crowns are also a great plant growth form that can be used in division. So the crown, usually we're talking about the root crown. So it's like the top of the roots right underneath the soil where all the roots come and join. Often they can be kind of like a maze of roots there that can be broken up or cut or pulled apart. If the stems aren't completely joined, then you can pull those apart. Sometimes you'll get a clump where those root crowns aren't all connected, and it's just a clumping form that can be pulled apart easily, and then you can, or use a knife to cut them apart to create new plants. Plants that do this, that are great for dividing their root crowns, are like the snake plant. Irises is similar to that. We talked about the rhizomes, prayer plant, daylilies, if you want more of them, which I don't because daylilies are everywhere. But at least it gives you a picture in your mind, if you've ever worked with those plants, of what we're talking about with the root crown. Rhizomes, I've mentioned that before. Here's a good picture showing you some iris rhizomes and how they start to die off when they get really thick in one area. You can see the picture on the right. The center area isn't producing any leaves and no flowers, partly because the soil's getting poor, it's been overused, but also because there's just no room. Those rhizomes take up all the space, and there's often can be no place for the new plants to grow, and so they get old and they stop producing leaves and they don't produce flowers. But the overgrown rhizomes can be really clumped, and you can pull them apart gently, or sometimes you can cut them off. I'd say if you do cut them, slice through the thick rhizome, definitely let it dry out in a cool, dry, shady spot for a couple of weeks before it calluses, let it callus over, and before you put it back in the soil. And here are just lists. The next 3 slides are lists of examples of different species and how they can be divided by these different types of growth forms and organs that were just mentioned. Now let's talk about propagation by layering. Layering is a natural process of lots of plants, not all plants, but a lot of plants that have large stems or branches that tend to hang down and touch the soil. So the plant grows up above the soil, and then branches get big, and from weight they lay back down and touch the soil. Think of like a raspberry or blackberry bush. It kind of grows up and sprawls, and then each branch leans over, and some of them touch the ground again. The strawberry plant is a great example. It doesn't have branches that stick up and then come down from weight, but it grows along the ground. It's the same process. Layering is just when stems touch the ground and have the ability, where they touch that moist soil, ability to form roots at that spot and form a new little center of growth. The strawberries send out these stolons, and at the node, if it's touching the soil, it'll form roots there and form a new plant. That is a layering process for that plant that's natural. A lot of tropical species do this because they get so long and viney, and there's a lot of moist soil around. So in the strawberry plant you're looking at, if we cut the red stolon between the mother plant and the new little growth spot, that would be a division. So we'd be, like I said in the last section of this lecture, we would be propagating that strawberry plant by division. We're dividing a plant that grows lots of growth points, has a clumping kind of pattern. But the plant itself is layering. So it's the strawberry one kind of relates to both layering and divisions, but the process of it forming roots off of the stem, in this case, is called layering. And we can use that to our advantage to propagate new species. So the process, when you're layering, you take the stem still attached to the mother plant, and we humans will take them and make them touch some soil. We can force the branches down to touch the soil and form roots, or they can do that on their own. In the severed, we can cut that plant off after it's done that, and we've used layering to propagate it and form new individuals. Often with layering, we do an intentional wounding too, so we won't just take the branches of a mother plant and pull them down and attach them to the soil or bury them to form roots. We will be wounding that part that is going to touch the soil, so it increases the chance of it forming roots there. Layering is a great technique, get high success rate. The new plantlets are attached to a mother plant while they're establishing themselves, so it's not like a cutting where you take a whole stem off of a mother plant and try to get it to root, which is, taking a plant down to very simple forms, and it cannot survive unless it can form roots. This is something that's already growing while it's attached to, metaphorically, the umbilical cord of the mother plant, so it's got some nutritional support while it's forming. There are different types of layering. There's simple layering, tip layering, compound layering, mound layering, and one of the more interesting ones, air layering. So we'll talk about each of those in the subsequent slides. Let's talk about simple layering first. So that is you've got your mother plant in the little image on the right there, and you bend down one of the branches to touch the ground. The part that's going to be kept underground, you can see like a little staple or hook that keeps it underground because that branch might want to fling back up. But you bury it, you staple it, and right at that bend, you can wound that branch that's put underground too. Sometimes it's just bending that branch at that spot enough that you kind of hear it starts to bend and crackle a little, like you know it's breaking a little. That's enough wounding, and then you would put that staple, like an irrigation staple or a little hook, to force it and keep it underground for a couple of months. And at that spot that was slightly bent and wounded, the roots will grow. Closer up picture of layering. You can see where the stem is sharply bent and roots will form as it's kept underground, that stem, and staked there and held there until it forms roots and can be cut off and form a whole new individual. Tip layering is different than simple layering when you're actually putting a portion of a stem underground. The tip layering is taking the very tip of a stem and pushing it underground and burying it using a staple or something to kind of hold that under there. And the place where the tips of those branches touch the ground and were buried, they will form roots, things like blackberries, raspberries, and those places can later be cut off and become individual separate plants. Compound layering is simply the same technique as simple layering and tip layering, but it's closer to simple layering when you're bending an existing stem and putting a portion of that stem underground. This is just where you can do that same stem, you would have it go underground and held under there, then part of it goes up and then down again. So you can see in the images what compound layering. You're getting a number of plants off the same stem from the mother plant by wounding it in a number of places and holding it underground for a given amount of time till it forms roots, often done with tropical vines like pothos and philodendron. Mound layering is where you have an existing plant, it's growing, a shrub, perhaps not very big, and in the dormant season you might cut it back, and in that spring a whole bunch of new shoots come out of that. Think of like suckers at the base of an apple tree or something like a fruit tree. And then you mound up, when you get all those new shoots coming out, you mound up soil above the normal surface of the soil, above and up around those multiple stems, and leave it there for a few months. Roots will form off of each of those stems, which can later, you'd pull the soil away and see all the roots off of each of those shoots, and you can cut each of those off and they become a separate individual plant. Root stocks for things like apples are done this way, where the rootstock farmers will have the apple trees growing in the ground, and they get a lot of shoots coming off of them. Then there's mounding soil up around them, the farmers will do, and each of those will can form roots and then can be sold as another rootstock. All of these techniques of layering are based on ancient Chinese methods of propagating. So this is a process that's thousands of years old, which is easy for me to imagine. You know, humans thousands of years ago were depending more directly on their food from animals and plants, so they probably were even more observant of plants' growth forms and noticed this layering technique, or not technique, but layering process happening in plants and learned how to take advantage of that. Air layering is a little different than the other ones in the sense that it's not taking stems and putting them into the soil or soil up around them. It's where you take a above ground stem or branch of some kind of woody plant and you wound it. You scrape off the outer layer of bark to expose the cambium, the layer of cells where the cells are dividing. And then you pack sphagnum moss or something that can hold moisture around that and wrap it with plastic and seal it. So you are creating a little wound that's protected from outside moisture and pathogens and from desiccation, from drying out. And you leave it like that little plastic bag around that portion of the stem that you wounded, maybe like an inch wound all the way around. or you don't have to do it all the way around, but partially is okay too. And you leave it there for a couple of months, 2 or 3, sometimes 4 months, and what can happen in plants that can be air layered is you'll get roots forming there, and then you can cut that whole branch off, and you got your own separate tree or plant ready to go. And a short list of different species that are very apt to do well with the air layering process. If you don't know what plants these are, because these are all the genus, the scientific names, look a couple of them up. They all grow around here, around Southern California, and I know you know magnolia. Lonicera is honeysuckle, and a couple of the other ones, if you're not sure what they are, just search it and find the common name. It'll mean more to you.